It is good to be with you. I'm Antonia Hilton. We start this hour with breaking news. Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee have just released transcripts and video from their deposition of former special counsel Jack Smith. Smith is the one who requested the full deposition be released. That was after his request for a public hearing was rejected. Now we have the details, what Jack Smith told lawmakers on December 17th. And it's the first time we're hearing from Jack Smith on the details of his investigation and his indictment of President Trump.
The timing and speed of our work reflects the strength of the evidence and our confidence that we would have secured convictions at trial. If asked whether to prosecute a former president based on the same facts today, I would do so regardless of whether that president was a Republican or a Democrat.
Let's bring in MS Now Capitol Hill reporter Kevin Fry, MS Now legal analyst Joyce Vance, a former U.S. attorney, and former HUD Secretary Julian Castro. Kevin, I'll begin with you. Break down for us, what more are we learning from these deposition transcripts?
Right. So this deposition lasts, or at least the transcript lasts, about 240 pages. It's 8 hours of video to comb through. Our team is dutifully doing that right now. But to tick through some of the key headlines here, he says that if the facts and the law did not justify going forward, he said to this committee that he would not have pursued, would not have been comfortable, or rather he would have been comfortable not going ahead with this case. He says that the case was built not just on those that opposed Trump, but also some of his allies and those that voted for him. He says that the AG, who of course was at the time a Biden appointee, and the president himself, President Biden, did not pressure him to find a case or to go after the president or actually press charges. He also notably took up an issue that has been hot on Capitol Hill in the last 2 months, where several Republican senators and one House member said that they had their phone records reviewed by the DOJ as part of this investigation. Jack Smith was looking into phone calls that the president had around the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and Smith basically pushed back at lawmakers and said that the responsibility for those phone calls and records being reviewed rests with Trump himself. We should note it's the records, not the actual transcripts. They weren't listening in real time. But perhaps the biggest headline here is this, as part of an exchange with one of the lawyers about the standing of this case. Take a listen.
You just made some pretty definitive statements about, your belief that President Trump was guilty of these charges. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe we had proof beyond a reasonable doubt in both cases.
And doesn't the Justice Manual prohibit prosecutors from asserting that a defendant is guilty of something before a jury makes a determination?
When a case is pending, yes.
So Jack Smith there, very confident in the case that he was able to bring. Of course, he was not able to bring either of those to trial because of, various instances. One other note here, of course, is the timing of all of this. This is now being released in the afternoon on New Year's Eve. This is seemingly designed to get lost, is what would one call a news dump on New Year's Eve in the middle of a very quiet week here in Washington. Of course, for Democrats who are going to be pouring through this, hoping to find things that they can highlight, this will, one, revive the January 6th case just ahead of the January 6th anniversary. The 5th anniversary is next week.
Joyce, I want to read for you one of the strong quotes from this deposition transcript. Jack Smith saying, exploiting that violence, President Trump and his associates tried to call members of Congress in furtherance of their criminal scheme, urging them to further delay certification of the 2020 election. I did not choose those members. President Trump did. Joyce, how do you read his tone? The fact that he doesn't mince words here. This does not seem like someone who's afraid of what we know many have been afraid of, which is that if you go against Trump in a definitive manner such as this, he's likely going to try to find a way to come after you next. How do you read his tone, his posturing here?
This is an experienced career prosecutor, someone who's done cases both domestically and in international courts. It's fair to characterize him as someone who is fearless, which is exactly what we, the public, are entitled to expect from our prosecutors. Without fear, without favor, that's the portrait that emerges of Jack Smith as we begin to review this testimony You know, the quote you read, I think, is a very important one. This echoes something that prosecutors frequently tell juries in closing arguments. And it's something that I've done many times with a jury. And it goes something like this. You tell the jury when you're talking about the witnesses that you were able to present to them, that you, the prosecutor, didn't pick the witnesses, that the defendant picks the witnesses, that those are the people he chooses to consort with, because often defense lawyers will argue about the credibility of witnesses that the prosecution puts on, people who were in essence co-conspirators and not exactly altar boys. And so that's something that prosecutors do frequently. Here, Jack Smith does a variant of it. He says, if you're unhappy that we tried to get your phone records, that's not on us, the prosecution. That's on Donald Trump, the man who chose to call you as events were transpiring on January 6th. And many of those incidents were publicly documented. There was newspaper reporting about calls that were made to one senator that were intended for brand new Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville. The senator who received the call actually handed his phone over to Tuberville, who spoke to Trump for several minutes as senators were being evacuated on January 6th. So it's important to understand that prosecutors were not, this was not a wiretap. They were not getting the contents of these calls. They were simply getting records that confirmed what phone calls were made, what numbers they were between, and what times they were made at. That's a real treasure trove of information for prosecutors in terms of identifying potential witnesses and other sorts of information. And it really would have been prosecutorial malpractice not to get those records. So although many of the Republican senators complained that this information was obtained by prosecutors, it's simply a very mundane prosecutorial practice to pull these sorts of records out.
Julian, what do you make of the timing of this release? That Kevin, he touched on this. You know, I think we're all familiar with the news dump, the strategy there at times, but also the fact that they've released this 8-hour video on YouTube after so much resistance over a public hearing, when Jack Smith made very clear that he was willing to tell this story, to state his case in front of the American people, in front of cameras from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, this is in politics the classic thing that you do when you want to bury something. You know, as Kevin mentioned, look, nobody is paying attention today compared to other days. It's New Year's Eve. People are on holiday, taking a break if they can. And so the politics of this are very clear. Republicans are doing it, but they don't think this is necessarily going to help their case. And to anybody that cares about transparency, the rule of law, due process, this is a very, significant moment in this case to celebrate, because the false narrative that's being put forth here is that somehow Jack Smith and the Biden Justice Department went on a witch hunt of Donald Trump. And the more transparency, the more sunlight we have, like this transcript and the video, I think the more you see that that's completely bogus. It's not true. That's why they're burying it on New Year's Eve.
I want to bring into the conversation now David Drucker, too. He's an MS Now contributor, senior writer at The Dispatch, and author of In Trump's Shadow. David, welcome to the conversation. I don't know how much time you've had to dig through this transcript, but I want to get your reaction both to its actual contents, but also to the context here. As we've heard, there's been the Republican spin around this, the allegations of improper accessing of phone transcripts. And what do you see? What's your impression from what Jack Smith stated definitively here?
Well, look, I mean, I think we're going to need more time to go through the transcript in full, parse it, and compare it to things that happened during the investigation and during Jack Smith's investigation of all of these matters. But I think it's pretty clear when the House Judiciary Committee releases this in full on a New Year's Eve that they don't think there's much here that vindicates the president or helps them make a case against a so-called Democratic Party witch hunt, right? Because if you're going to do that, number one, you wait until next week when everybody's back and focused on things. Number two, you might even do it in sort of drips and drabs, if you will. You're going to release this one day, release this the next day, this the next day. so that it could be poured over and talked about and analyzed, and people could sit with it. And then there's more, and then there's more. And it builds a real narrative and a momentum that maybe the president was right after all, that they were coming after him without cause. And that just doesn't, it never appeared to be the case. You know, the New York district attorney's case, accepting, even though Trump was convicted there, he had a really good case to make, but that was all political. But when you look at January 6th, and when you look at his refusal to give back executive branch documents after he left office, those were good cases to make. And it doesn't seem, at least from the way the committee handled the release of this transcript, that we would expect to find smoking guns or nuggets in there that the president is going to be able to latch onto to make the case he still likes to make, which is, I was the subject of a witch hunt. They came out after me, without any cause or reasoning other than politics.